So Vanessa is going to be presenting to us on her presentation, Interracial Social Support, What Not to Say. She is a fourth year in the social psychology department, working with Keith Spencer and Lisa Libby. And one of her main research interests is examining interracial social support and how she might be better able to understand how to relate to and support people of different races. So thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you. So like Elizabeth said, this is a project that I've been working on with Lisa Libby and Steve Spencer on interracial social support. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are talking to someone of a different race than you, and they come to you recounting some negative experience that they've had, maybe with some racial discrimination. What type of support would you give to this person, right? How would you respond to them? They're clearly in need of some type of support, right? Maybe you offer some statement like, oh, I'm really sorry that that happened to you. That really sucks. Maybe you give them some advice, right? Or maybe you just give them a hug, right? Maybe you just nod along and listen to them, right? There are a lot of different ways in which we can respond to someone in need of social support. And through research, we know that social support is beneficial, right? We have a need to belong. We have this fundamental need to connect with other human beings, right? And a good way in which we can do that is by providing and providing and receiving social support, right? And lots of research has shown that social support protects our mental and physical health in times of distress. And a lot of this research specifically is looking at perceived support. So it's not necessarily, did I receive support objectively or not, but how supported do I feel by the type of support that I received? And this is what we're going to focus on today, this perceptions of support. We're specifically going to look at verbal social support here, looking at the differences between sympathy, which we're defining as the acknowledgement of thoughts and feelings. So this is going to be saying things like, wow, that really sucks. I'm sorry that happened to you, right? Just acknowledging that someone has gone through something negative. Compared to empathy, which there's a whole lot of different definitions of empathy in the literature, but we're defining it as the ability to share or understand the feelings or experiences of another, specifically this experience sharing piece. And this is going to be when people say things like, I know how you feel, the same thing happened to me, right? This is where someone says, I understand what you're going through, maybe because I've been through that too. Right? And generally, people think sympathy and empathy are supportive, right? That's generally what we're told, that we should be empathic, that we should be sympathetic towards other people. But there might be cases in which empathy is unsupportive, right? Empathy requires, to some extent, some level of experiential understanding, right? We need to be able to understand what someone is going through to be able to say that we understand, ideally, right? And so sometimes the results of the intended social support may not be beneficial, right? Back to this perceptions of social support, right? Understanding another person requires getting perspective. It requires a lot of effort to truly understand what someone is going through, not just saying, oh, well, if I were in your situation, this is what I would do, right? There's going to be discrepancies in how well we can truly understand what someone else has experienced, right? And part of the issue here could be misperceptions of similarity. So this is going to be when we misunderstand how similar our experiences are to another person, right? Whether we can truly empathize or truly understand that experience. If we can't, and we have this misunderstanding, claims of empathy can come across as false or fake. And this is going to be interracial interactions are a specific case in which this might be especially true, right? Where the negative effects of empathy may come out pretty clearly, right? Interracial interactions, they can be awkward and stressful, right? A lot of people come in with different goals, different expectations for how those interactions will play out, right? Maybe one person is concerned about appearing prejudiced or not. And so in these situations, misunderstanding the situation and how similar you are to the support receiver is going to have a big impact. So in this current research, we're looking at, okay, do people recognize when to use empathy over sympathy? Are people sensitive to different contexts in which empathy might be inappropriate? Right, so I have two studies here. In study one, well, in both studies, we're looking at Black and white participants. And in study one, we're predicting that Black and white participants will differ in the type of support, empathy versus sympathy, that they offer to a Black support recipient. And this difference will occur specifically when the context is racial versus non-racial, right? So when someone is recounting some racial experience versus a non-racial negative experience. So participants first, they read a little vignette. I'll show you an example of that in a second, but a Black person is sharing some negative event and they're in need of your support, the participant support. We ask them just free response. How would you respond to this person? And then our main DV here is going to be ratings of empathy and sympathy statements that we provide them, and how likely they would be to say these in response to this person in the vignette. And then we have some additional measures looking at perceived experiential similarity and internal motivation to respond without prejudice. So we had 3 conditions in this study. The first condition, so we set it up that KJ is 35 years old and identifies as Black, and they recount this negative racial experience. As KJ continues to talk, it becomes clear that they're feeling upset and could use some support. In our other 2 conditions, both other conditions are non-racial, but we wanted to compare between a non-racial issue that most people have experienced versus most people haven't experienced. So in one non-racial situation or vignette, we have the seizure disorder, making the assumption that most people don't regularly experience seizures, versus our other non-racial situation in which we talk about loneliness, right? Most people have experienced to some extent loneliness at one time in their life. Right, so we have this racial, seizure, and loneliness conditions. And we're asking again, how likely would you be to say the following statements? There's a few different ones that I'll show you. We're asking them to rate how experientially similar they are to KJ, the Black support receiver. And then we have that internal motivation question in there. So basically what we find, we first wanted to make sure that our conditions were mapping on to this similarity piece, and we find that they are. So Black participants felt most experientially similar to the target in the racial and lonely conditions, right? They've experienced racial discrimination, they've experienced loneliness, whereas white participants only felt similar to the target in the loneliness condition, right? So this is indicating to us that our conditions are functioning as we expected. So these are the statements that they rated. These are sympathy items, these are empathy items. So our main DV here is this statement likelihood. So how likely would you be to say these statements to KJ? And we find this significant 3-way interaction. But really what I want to focus your attention on for the purposes of this talk is this right here. So in the racial condition, empathy from white versus Black support givers was less likely to be offered. Whereas for sympathy, it was pretty high across the board, right? But here we're seeing that, okay, white people are recognizing, hey, maybe my empathy in this situation is not going to be well received. We also wanted to test, okay, are they understanding their experiential similarity, right? So the more similar in experiences, the more likely participants would be to offer empathy to this Black receiver. And so we tested this model. You can ask questions about it later because it's complicated, but basically we find a significant indirect effect such that if participant race is going to determine, so if I'll just walk through an example. Let's say we have a Black participant and they're in the racial condition, they're going to find their experiences more similar to KJ, which would predict greater use of empathy, versus a white participant in that same condition is going to have less perceived similarity, which would predict greater sympathy. So we're positing here that this understanding of when to use empathy or not is dependent on this perceptions of similarity based on the context that participants are in. So people are generally getting it right? This is good. But we still want to know, okay, what about those who maybe aren't getting it right? And this is where internal motivation to respond without prejudice measure comes in. So essentially, we found that amongst white participants, we're not looking at this measure with Black participants. Amongst white participants, internal motivation to respond without prejudice was negatively correlated with perceived experiential similarity. So the more participants are motivated to be unprejudiced towards Black people, the less similar they view their experiences. So we again tested this fun model here. We find a significant indirect effect such that for participants who are higher in internal motivation, indicating that they have a motivation to act unprejudiced towards Black people, when they're in this racial situation, racial condition, they're like, yeah, my experiences aren't similar, so I'm going to use sympathy and not empathy, right? But for people who are low in internal motivation, when they're in this racial condition, they're saying, you know what, actually, my experience is pretty similar, so I think it's appropriate for me to offer empathy, in which is what we're kind of terming this inappropriate empathy, right? Might not be well received. Okay. So people determine whether they have a similar experience and offer support accordingly, right? This is great. People offer empathy when they perceive experiential similarity to be high. And participants seem to recognize this for the racial and the seizure conditions, right? So it's not just race, it's just about this perceptions of similarity here. And internal motivation might be predicting why white people continue to offer empathy when it otherwise might be inappropriate. So study 2, we're going to replicate all of these findings. And we're going to use a different DV here. So we collected actual responses that participants gave in study 1. We're going to use those for study 2. So similar setup, right? Now we're using actual statements to examine perceived supportiveness by context and race. Again, these are Black and white participants in this study. We have a very similar procedure. They read a very similar vignette, but now we're asking how supportive is. There's now a white person in the vignette and they're going to respond to KJ. How supportive are these statements that this person could have given? We still ask about our same empathy and sympathy statements to replicate that effect. And then we have our same similarity in internal motivation measures. So we made a couple tweaks to the vignette, but it's pretty much the same. But now Alex and KJ are in the situation, and now we pipe in for each participant 9 different statements that Alex could have responded to KJ with. Same 3 conditions in this study. Now our perceptions of experiential similarity are not between participant and the Black target, but between the white support giver and the Black support receiver. Okay, so just replicating our statement likelihood finding, things are looking like they did in study 1, where we see that Black participants are offering more empathy in this racial condition compared to white participants, but that sympathy is higher across all race and conditions. So that's good. We replicated that finding. This is our new DV here, perceived supportiveness. So we removed participant race from this model because the support giver and receiver are held constant in the vignettes. And we find the significant 2-way interaction between support type and condition, where participants rate empathy as less supportive in the racial versus non-racial conditions. And empathy is less supportive than sympathy in this racial condition, mirroring what we found with our statement likelihood. But essentially, participants are still recognizing, okay, empathy is maybe not going to be as supportive as sympathy in this interracial interaction. So we wanted to test this model again, but now we're taking out participant race because, again, this perceptions of similarity is between white respondent and Black target. And we find a significant indirect effect here such that, all right, depending on the condition, I'm going to figure out whether I'm experientially similar to this person, which will predict if I'm more similar, I'll use more empathy. If I'm less similar, I'll use more sympathy. And we wanted to test this model again for internal motivation. Long story short, the model works out the same in study 2 as well. So wrapping it up, our hypotheses are generally supported across 2 studies. It seems that perceived similarity of experience plays a role in the perceptions of support, such that the more similar experientially support giver and receiver are, the greater perceived support of empathy. And overall, it seems that people are perceiving sympathy versus empathy as more supportive in these interracial contexts, and that they're generally getting it right on when empathy might not be as supportive. But when they don't get it right, it might be because they hold these misperceptions of experiential similarity, maybe something operating through this internal motivation to respond without prejudice. Okay, I wanted to leave you with just this one last takeaway. Basically, this research is suggesting that maybe it's best to stay away from this interracial empathy unless you can truly understand what someone is going through. And even then, you should add some limitations to empathy, right? In general, it seems that sympathy is going to be perceived as more supported in these cross-race interactions than empathy. But that is all I have. Thank you very much. I went through all that really fast, so happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I have a question. In your three-way interaction, it looked like, and I don't know because this wasn't what you were pointing out, but it looked like that maybe your Black participants were also offering less empathy than sympathy in the racialized stressor. That so if you look at the first two
Yes.
compared to the first person of the sympathy.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Is empathy, is it not just interracial empathy that could be problematic? Is it kind of problematic in general to make someone else's story about you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, short answer to that, yes, right? But also with these statements, so participants were rating all these statements at once. So it could just be, I've already selected 2 statements from here, I'll only select 2 statements from here, right? So we can't really tell exactly, you know, it's not an equal give and take here. Participants could just be like, I like these 4 statements the best, that's what I'll choose, right? But yeah, basically it could be, you know, hey, maybe I should just not enter myself into the equation at all and just provide support, you know, not along. But yeah, we can't exactly get at that point with these data that we have, which is why we wanted to measure just perceived supportiveness of statements and see how that mapped on. But yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
In study 1, you had a 3-way interaction between, was it condition,
Condition, participant race, and support type.
and then you ran a conditional indirect effect model with the condition and supportiveness statements as moderators.
Yeah.
Did you consider one where there was moderating deviations and allow the 3-way interaction to be a part of that model?
We looked at a lot of different things, and I honestly don't remember what all we looked at this point. I think we might have tried that, and it might have worked out. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, thank you for your question. All right, yeah.
This is going a lot beyond what you were talking about, so feel free to just ignore this. Is there any connection between sympathy and pity? Like, to some extent, could I go far enough with sympathy where now you feel like I'm pitying me, and then that also would not be considered social supportive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, in study 1, we had a measure of perceived helplessness of the target. And we found that people who were higher in like internal motivation and those types of measures perceived the Black target to be more helpless and to pity them a little bit more. But yeah, some of the sympathy items could be spoken in this pitying way versus just acknowledgement way. We haven't been able to tap into that yet, but it's a super interesting question of sometimes sympathy is going to be more supportive, but if the sympathy that you offer is like, oh, poor you, yeah, you know, that type of pity, it's not going to be any better than empathy. So we want to follow that up and maybe tap into that in future studies.
Did you say the ones that were higher in the internal motive?
Sorry, lower.
Oh, lower.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, people who have more prejudiced attitudes towards.